So we're going to think about Abraham this morning, and I'm going to read some verses from Genesis chapter 12, and we're going to read the first 9 verses of that chapter. The Lord said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abraham left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and all the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abraham travelled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on towards the hills of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abraham set out and continued towards the Negev. So I've entitled this talk "Faith in the Time of COVID." When I say the word faith, I wonder what sorts of people and situations come to your mind. Perhaps Abraham was one of those people that you thought of, or maybe your thoughts go towards Hebrews 11, which has that list of great heroes of faith. And we read those first 2 verses at the beginning of our time together. My mind also goes to my Sunday school days. I was brought up in a church family, and every year we used to have a Sunday school prize giving, and we always used to get books, religious books, generally speaking. And one of the series of books that I got given was called Heroes of Faith and Fame, I think it was, and a number of well-known Christians who had given their lives for Jesus in extraordinary ways. One of them, William Carey, he was one of my heroes. He was one of the first missionaries to go overseas. And by the time he had died, William Carey had spent 41 years in India without any furlough. His mission at the end of his time there could only count, well, I say only, 700 converts. I think we would be quite thrilled about that. But it was in a nation of millions. His first convert, Krishna Pal, came after 7 years of hard graft in that land. But he laid an impressive foundation for Bible translations into India's major languages, education and social reform. And perhaps his greatest legacy was the worldwide missionary movement that followed, with missionaries like Adoniram Judson, Hudson Taylor and David Livingstone among the many thousands who were inspired by him. He had a motto, which was expect great things for God, expect great things for God, attempt great things for God. And the history of Protestant missions is in many ways an extended commentary of that phrase that he coined all those years back. It's good to read those biographies and be inspired. But sometimes, you know, we can read those things and think, oh, well, there's no point in me trying to exercise faith because I'll never be as good as those people. I'll never aspire to things like they did. But I want to remind you of Abraham, somebody who started off with a first step, with a small step, and yet God used him to inspire many people down through the years and used him to be the father of nations. There are three things I want to think about as far as Abraham was concerned. The first is that God gave him a challenge. The Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." God gives Abraham a challenge. This is what I want you to do, Abraham. And God gives us a challenge. If we choose to follow Jesus, this is something that we would expect. Just as God spoke to Abraham, he'll speak to us too. Three things about this challenge. The first thing is that Abraham listened to God. He was in tune with God. He heard God's voice. My daughter Jemima is learning to play the cornet at the moment. And the other day I was accompanying her on the piano. I was in tune. Jemima was out of tune, and we heard this voice from Sabre, my wife, saying, "Jemima, you need to retune your instrument. You're out of tune. It doesn't sound good." In the same way, you know, you and I get out of tune with God, don't we? And we don't find ourselves in the place where we're ready to hear his voice, where we're ready to listen to him. Are we listening? Are we giving him time to speak to us, just as Abraham must have done? In many ways, during this lockdown time, we've had more times of quiet, more opportunities perhaps, just to give time to hear what God is saying to us. What are the moments when God has our fullest attention, when he can speak to us? So first, he listened to God. Second, he was open to God using him. Age and circumstances weren't a barrier to Abraham. He was 75 years old, after all. Moses, who came a little bit later, was 80, really, when God started to use him in the ways that he's famous for. If you think of the other end of the scale, Samuel was probably only in single figures when God spoke to him. Age is not a barrier. All the things that often we put up as excuses are not a barrier to God using us. The time of God's greatest usefulness is not necessarily those years when we leave school and when we retire. It's not that time necessarily. God can use us at any time, no matter what age you are. And you know, many people, particularly when COVID started and we started looking ahead and thinking, oh goodness, this is going to go on for so long, almost shut up shop and said, oh, God can't use us now, we're in lockdown. The amazing thing is that God is greater than COVID. God is greater than any of the restrictions that we as Christians sometimes put on God. God is greater than those things. And we need just to be open to him using us. We need to say, God, yeah, things aren't as we would have chosen them to be, but what now? How can you use me now? Abraham was open to that. And thirdly, Abraham, as far as this challenge was concerned, was willing to be stretched. It meant that he was taken out of his comfort zone. When we were younger, my gran used to babysit for us, and we always liked that as boys, because when my parents were down at the prayer meeting, Gran didn't know any better and allowed us to watch Star Trek, which my mum and dad weren't too sure about. So we used to watch Star Trek. We always used to enjoy when Gran came to babysit for us when the prayer meeting was on. And I always recall, and those of you who've watched it will recall what the mission was. It said, space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. its 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. And the thing is, you know, when God calls us and challenges us, he will be challenging us to boldly go where others have not been before. It will be stretching for us. There will be times when the things Jesus challenges us to do will make us feel distinctly uncomfortable. And maybe COVID has been that. I mean, just getting used to all this technology has not necessarily been a particularly comfortable experience, particularly at the beginning. Perhaps it's even made us afraid. But if we're walking with Jesus, he will be leading us into good, exciting discoveries. And remember that when he challenges us, he always promises to go with us. The second main thing is that God gave Abraham a challenge, but he also gave him a promise. He says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. God commands and challenges are always accompanied by his promises for us. And it's great to hold on to those promises, particularly when things get tough, as we seek to meet those challenges that God has given us. The first thing I want you just to think about is that God's promises remind us that there is always a purpose in what God is calling us to do. Excuse me. There is a bigger picture than just the challenge to our faith. God isn't just asking us to do things to make himself happy, to satisfy his desire to see us active. God has a purpose in the things that he is challenging us to do. Purposeless experiences get us down. And I think, you know, for many, people's mental health has been affected by this COVID thing because people just can't think beyond the problem. It just seems purposeless going through all of this that we're going through. But if we know that there is a purpose behind what we're going through, it gives us hope. It gives us purpose. When I was at work, there were one or two cynical people I used to work with, and there was a poster on one of the wall that said, I thought I saw a light at the end of the tunnel, but it was only a colleague bringing me more work. More grind, more work, no hope of relief. And many people have viewed COVID in that way. It just seems more of the same and more pain. But, you know, I believe, and God's proved it in so many ways, that there is a purpose to what we are going through, and a purpose to some of the challenges and the discomfort that we are feeling, not just at this time, but at other times too. God has a purpose. God called Abraham to do this for a purpose. Romans 8:28 says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. There's a reason behind it. Second, God's promises remind us that his challenges are for our good. They are for our good. God says to Abraham, I will bless you and make you a blessing. God had plans to do Abraham and his family, all who were connected with him, good. And he has good plans for you too. Do you remember the Israelites when they got sent into captivity? And they were thinking, what's the point of this? We're here in Babylon. This can't be God's plan for us to be here. And God speaks through Jeremiah, a verse that's often been quoted during this time. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. God promises good things for us. Whatever he brings into our lives, he works together for our good. Even those things that he allows to come into our lives, which wouldn't be of our choosing, God, in the grand scheme of things, is working these things for our good. And we need to hold on to that, hold on to the promises of God, just like Abraham did. Thirdly, God's promises remind us that his plans are great. His plans are great. God's promise was not that at the end of the journey, Abraham would sit down and have a meal with his new neighbours and settle down, or that he would own his own little patch of ground. In fact, Abraham never had any of those promises fulfilled in his lifetime. He did own a burial patch, but apart from that, he never inherited the land. But God's promises were great for him. God says, I will make you a great nation, and all nations will be blessed through you. Very often we see the challenges that God gives us in our own little bubble, but we need to think outside that bubble and see the things that God is calling us to do in the light of eternity and in the light of his greater plans and his purposes. One of our trustees at Tunbridge Baptist Church, Paul Martin, was preaching last Sunday, and he was going through a really difficult time. And one thing that gave him hope was a sermon he heard. He didn't remember a huge amount about it. And this tough time he was going, he was just wondering where God was in the midst of it all. And this preacher just said a little sentence, and it was this: what is happening to you is not what's going on. In other words, the things that were happening directly to Paul were part of a much bigger picture. In the midst of it, Paul couldn't see outside of his problem. Paul Martin couldn't see outside of his problem, but God was saying there are bigger things that are happening outside of this. And one day you'll be able to see what they are. And that gave him encouragement to go on. We have a great God, don't we? And his purposes and plans for us are great. And God was telling Abraham that. And fourthly, these promises remind us that his plans and purposes are steadfast and sure. God will deliver on his promise. Nothing can stop God's plans and his purposes. There's a little line in this promise that we may sort of react against a little bit, because God says, I will bless those who bless you, Abraham, and whoever curses you, I will curse. I find that a bit harsh, don't you? And perhaps a bit counter to the God of love we seek to portray to others. But you know, if God's plans and purposes are for good, there will be times where God intervenes to make sure that his good purposes are fulfilled, because there are people and powers out there that seek to oppose God's good plan and purposes for his world. Some do that by persecuting those who love Jesus and by trying to disrupt the good order of things in society. But God won't stand by passively and watch his world be wrecked. No, those who oppose him will reap their reward. Sin and disobedience have their own reward. As Paul reminds us in Romans, the wages of sin is death. And God will do everything to ensure that his plans and purposes, that his promises are steadfast and sure. The third main thing I want you to think about is obedience. Because it's great, isn't it, to have God's challenge? It's great to have God's promises. But what if it stops there? What if it doesn't go any further? We read, in response to God's challenge and his promises, Abraham went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. I want to use the word but at this point. If the story had simply finished at the challenge and the blessings that were promised, would we be reading it now? I was watching earlier this week, Friday, in fact, I think it was. My son, he likes a film on Friday. We call it Film Friday. And so we were watching the Jungle Book film, which is one of his favourites. And after the credits had rolled on, it then immediately went on to one of these extras that are on the DVD. And it showed an alternative ending to the film, one that they considered but hadn't used. And it was one where there had been another antagonist, and one in which Mowgli had appeared to triumph and become the hero in the village, rather than the ending that there was, where he finds his place in village life and Baloo the bear and Bagheera the panther go off singing into the jungle the bare necessities. So there was a different ending that might have been used. Just suppose the story of Abraham was that he heard God's challenge, absolutely loved the promises, but he didn't trust God. What if he had said, thanks God, but my roots are here in Haran and I'm comfortable here. I don't plan to move anytime soon. Or, God, that sounds really good, but what sort of reception am I going to have? I'm a bit fearful of what it might mean for all my family. Look, it's not just me that's going to be affected, it's everyone else. If Abraham had said, it's too big a risk, God, I'm not going to make those first steps in obedience to you, we would probably never have heard of him. But thankfully, that's not what's happened, is it? Abraham got up and he left and he did what God told him. Three things here. First of all, his obedience was based on faith. He trusted God. He had no assurance that things were going to work out. He had God's word. And when we trust God and we step out not knowing what's ahead, it's based on faith, isn't it? When we disobey or resist God, we are really saying to God, I don't trust you. I don't trust you. Abraham wasn't perfect. We know that. After the story that we read, he goes down to Egypt and gets into a terrible state by lying about his wife to Pharaoh. But you know, when we do trust God and take that first small step, God blesses us. And it's been a real challenge for us, hasn't it, through this COVID time? But those little steps of faith often lead to bigger things. The second thing is his obedience was wholehearted. We're told that he took everything. He didn't hedge his bets and think, oh, well, I'll leave half of my herd behind in the safekeeping of another relative, just in case it doesn't work out. No, he took everything, his family, his cattle, everything was committed to God. He was wholehearted in his obedience. When I attended the Way to Life crusade back in 1977 now, seems a long time ago, I went forward as Dick Saunders, the evangelist, challenged us about following Jesus. One of the songs they sang was a song, the choir sang, was a song that said, I have decided to follow Jesus. And each verse ends with the line, no turning back, no turning back. I find that tremendously challenging. The commitment to follow Jesus, despite our failures and disobedience, is a lifelong, wholehearted commitment to God. And when God challenges us to follow him, will we respond wholeheartedly like Abraham did? And thirdly, his obedience wasn't without trouble and difficulty, was it? He had lots of problems in his life, but God was with him through all of those troubles. Twice he misled rulers about Sarah, his wife. He had trouble when he had a child through Sarah's Egyptian maidservant, Hagar. His relationship with Lot was stretched and tested. He faced the huge challenge of sacrificing his son Isaac. And in his lifetime, as we've already thought, he never inherited all of the promise that God had given him. But ask Abraham whether it was worth it despite all those problems, and he would say a resounding yes. I want to just pause for a moment and bring things up to date as we draw things to a close. We thought about the challenge of faith, about God's promises, and about obeying God. But what might God be calling us as individuals and churches in the light of what's been going on this last year? Stuart Davison, our SEBA area representative, often puts up a thought for the day. He does most days. And one of them was quite challenging for me. You know, as churches, perhaps one of the first steps of faith we need to make is really start asking some questions about what we've learned as a result of COVID. And one thing he posted, Stuart Davidson, was this, which I thought was quite challenging, from a guy called Bob Jackson. And he says, as a result of what we've learned as churches, he said, I think we need to think about having wider doors, not just physical doors on our church, but, you know, other things that we need to think about that we've done electronically that will need to continue once we start meeting together. He talked about deeper wells. How can we offer spiritual depth and encourage encounter with the living Jesus? I think many people who've never been to church have engaged with church through online ministry and are hungry and are seeking what God can offer for them at this time. They've been challenged about the meaning of life and real authentic faith. Are we going to be able to respond? And we need to dig those deeper wells of authenticity so that what we're offering people is real, so that people can relate to a real God who comes into our lives. And with deeper wells, we need to rely more on the Holy Spirit, don't we, to empower and enable us for what God has ahead for us. And it may be looking at our church programs, the things that we've done before. What might need to stop? What needs to continue? What might we need to start? What might need to change? Are we going to be like Abraham and step forward in faith as we seek God and as he brings to us those challenges? And finally, smarter structures. We may need to rethink the way that we do church. You know, that's tremendously challenging and unsettling for us all. But as we go forward from here, what is God saying to us? Just as Abraham was open to what God was saying to him, are we open to what God is saying to us? Just want to finish with a story. John MacArthur, who's a minister in America, told a story about when he was at college. He used to be in the college athletics relay team, and it was the 400-meter relay. The first guy in his team was a great runner. John MacArthur was going to do the second leg, A guy called Ted ran the third leg, and the last runner, John MacArthur, described as a blur. And if they were able to get the baton to him anywhere near the front, he would probably win the race for the team. And the race started, and there was a great first leg. The first guy ran a brilliant leg and handed over the baton to John in first place. And John took the baton and he said, I ran the race of my life. And I was able to hand the baton over also in third to Ted. And Ted started well, but halfway around the track, he stopped and sat down. And the race went on, and everyone in his team were worried. Had he pulled a hamstring? What was wrong? Had he injured himself? And when John MacArthur got over to Ted, he asked him what the matter was. And Ted said, I didn't feel like running anymore. And John says he remembered his reply. He said, you didn't feel like running. You're not alone, you know. You're part of a team. And you know, God is challenging us like Abraham to be part of that hall of fame. He's given us the baton to hand on to others. Will you be part of that long list of people of faith who've taken simple steps, small steps for God, and seen God do great things for the glory of his name, for the next generation of those in West Malling Baptist Church? May we be those who demonstrate faith in our great God at a time of COVID and beyond. Amen. Amen. We're going to sing a hymn of dedication